Well, I grew up in town St. Thomas, Ontario, born at the beginning of the 60s, so at the end of the baby boom. And it was a great place to grow up, but I always thought it was small. There was, but I kind of wanted to try something different. So I joined the reserves.
Right.
And that gave me a little bit of pocket money, some training experiences, which I thought were really fantastic. When I look back on it, it was like, you got to go to Ipperwash for a weekend, or Borden, maybe Petawawa, which were exciting places if you came from St. Thomas, because none of my friends had ever been in those places, and you got to do cool things. I had a plan. It was brilliant and cunning. I'd go to university, go to the seminary for a year. God's will be done. And so I stayed 1 year, 2 years, stayed all through seminary, and was happily ordained a priest. My local bishop gave me permission to re-enter the regular army in 1991. And that's where the two worlds kind of crossed. I stayed in the regular forces until I was medically released in 99.
So in 1992, as you obviously know, Canada sent about 1,400 men to Somalia. So heading into that Somalia mission in 92, from your perspective, what was it about, and what was Canada's role as you understood it?
As I understood it at the time, it would be different than how I understand it now, having read some pretty scholarly papers on what happened. Two things happened in the Horn of Africa. The government failed again, and the media was there in Mogadishu to see the extreme poverty and the death and just total famine. I think if the media had not been there, this chapter wouldn't need to be written. For the first part of our training in Petawawa, it was all blue beret, white vehicles, and the regiment had been training for a mission in Western Sahara that didn't go, but we were on standby for about 8 or 9 months. So lots of tension, lots of anxiety, missions canceled. Then this Somalia mission comes up. It's got UN in it, so it's a UN sort of thing. And very quickly, overnight, Maroon Berets came back. Anything UN on the vehicles had to be scrubbed. Whole different attitude, as opposed to peacekeeping. Chapter 6, Chapter 7, I believe, is peacemaking.
Right.
Totally.
Changed very quickly.
Very quickly changing a mindset. It was a challenge to take this group of men and women that had been trained to do one thing and literally within days say, no, it's going to be different now.
Right.
So to create the mindset, to establish the mission format and the rules of engagement. I didn't see the rules of engagement until just about June when we came home.
Interesting.
And it was 13 pages long.
Wow.
We arrived in the country where we would be escorting convoys, creating the conditions for peaceful discussions and negotiations amongst the clans and the government. But it turns out there really was no government. There was no rule of law. So anything we were supposed to do that involved the local government agency, well, the government agency wasn't there.
How did the locals respond to your humanitarian efforts?
Depending on the clan, sometimes very, very well. But if we were dealing with a clan that didn't particularly have anything in our area, they would be quite belligerent.
I see.
And to our surprise, they had heavy weapons.
Right.
And were not afraid to use them. And so, I guess the mindset was, we're here to help you, and it clearly looks like you don't want to be helped.
Right.
Or we shouldn't help those people, we should help you. And for the average soldier, that's very confusing.
How do you sort all of that out?
I don't know. And then there was lots and lots of weapons, so there was a program to kind of search for weapons or confiscate weapons, or they would bring weapons in. And so we did what soldiers do. We patrolled, made roads safe, helped the ICRC set up feeding centers, did some humanitarian work. But the broader picture of where does this fit into reestablishing a country or rule of law, I don't think that was supposed to be our job.
I see. Can you give me a sense of the difficulty of managing the complex, sometimes conflicting role of soldier versus peacekeeper, particularly in such a chaotic and often violent environment?
We are peacemakers.
Mm-hmm.
So the mandate changed from peacekeeping to peacemaking.
Right.
So it doesn't mean you're warlike and you just want to start thumping people
Mm-hmm.
or hurting people. No, but now the rules of engagement have shifted.
Sure.
And it was funny because it didn't shift in the mind of the average Canadian, because the media would come over and say things like, "Well, I'm surprised you're all carrying weapons."
Right.
You know, and what are these old weapons over here? This looks like old Russian or German stuff.
Right.
Well, it is. That's what we confiscated in the last 2 days.
Right.
Well, where'd you get that from? The Somalis. Well, why do they have weapons?
Right.
So, you know, and so we'd take them to a feeding center and there wouldn't be many people. And we'd be way out in the desert, you know, and they'd, well, where's the people? Well, they died.
Mhm.
Well, why'd they die? Starvation.
Yeah.
Well, what did you guys do? There's nothing we could do.
So having signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, do you think that Canada embodied the spirit of the Declaration, you know, the promotion of defense of universal human rights during the mission?
You know, I think that all the declarations and statements and conventions are important in that they lay out for us goals and objectives that our humanity strives for.
Mm-hmm.
There was not a lot of discussion on universal rights. And that doesn't mean that the soldiers weren't very, very aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a good example of a moral dilemma.
Sure.
A number of young women around the age of puberty were dying of sepsis, I think it was.
Okay.
Horrible infections. And the medics, you know, we had little clinics. So we did set up clinics and we did try to do those things.
Sure.
But they didn't always work out the way we thought they would.
Mm-hmm.
There was no way we could try to do anything to get them to stop. They weren't going to. We tried everything. We'll give you extra grain. We'll give you extra food. We'll do this. We'll do that. Do it anyway. Those questions you don't ask a kid with a grade 11 Cape Breton education is not supposed to be answering those questions.
Yeah. Do you mind if I show you a photograph and just ask you for some context?
Sure.
So, because you are the man in the photo,
Yeah.
could you provide just a little more context on what's going on here?
Sure. So this is a photograph taken by a vehicle going past the road. It's actually, in this picture, there's five young people.
Yeah.
And they're tied, and there's signs around their neck, and they're blindfolded.
Yeah.
And I'm standing behind them.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming through the fences, and of course, what Canadian soldier is going to shoot a child? Because they're stealing water bottles, they're stealing bits of equipment, part of a fuel pump. Right. Which meant the fuel pump couldn't be used, which means you can't fill the helicopters, which means you have no more tactical support from them, and you have no more ambulances that can get people to the big hospital in Mogadishu.
It's a significant cog to the entire supply chain.
It is.
Yeah.
Now it's gone.
Now it's gone.
Children like this, I don't know if it's these exact ones, had been taken into the village before, and within hours they're right back, and away it goes again.
Mm-hmm.
So the interpreters said, look, here, put these signs on them. And they'd probably say, I'm a thief.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a thief.
Yeah.
So some shame. Tie him up. The Somali interpreters are trying to intimidate them. Now, coming out from the village were a group of elders. It wasn't a long walk, but they came out. They'd heard this was going on. And I'm there, give it in English or give it in Somali, and goes back and forth. So they hand me a machete that was a piece of old spring steel.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the children are hearing it in their language real time.
Right.
And it's basically like, you're the local religious leader, just cut their hands off.
Wow.
Saves us doing it.
Yeah.
You do it, and then you'll be seen to be really strong, and just cut their hands off.
Right.
So I'm holding this. The kids have heard it right away.
Yeah.
You know, and then the translator has to say, you know,
Sure.
well, they want you to cut their hands off. This
Yeah.
is what they're saying. Blah 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 blah. Hand the thing back. No,
Yeah.
we don't do this. But this is so far at this point, so far out of our scope of duties.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, anything we do with civilians, if you take them prisoner
Right.
for some infraction, you have to give them to civilian police. So at the same time, this United Task Force,
Mm-hmm.
not the UN, was trying to recreate a Somali police force.
I see.
The nation's watching us.
Right.
And these people depend on us. And our role
Mhm.
really is to make space,
Mm-hmm.
to give them space to have the discussions that they need to have.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think one of the challenges is we didn't know what success looked like.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that anything that the gift of Somalia to the army would have been, I think, that moment to ask the big questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just because these men and women are qualified at these levels,
Mm-hmm.
are they also qualified to do those things?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know the other step that should have been in there, but
Mm-hmm.
clearly something did not go well.
Right.
And I don't think we ever got to answer that. You know, we're out in June and had with these guys I served with in Somalia. There wasn't a conversation we didn't have, like, what would we have done different, Padre? Did we fail, Padre? You know, what a terrible summary of a man's career when he looks back and thinks, the greatest amount of effort I gave was all for naught. And that these men carry it. They've all had great careers, done amazing things with their life, but somehow this thing, the stain that they believe is there, follows them. And they're looking for some personal contribution they could have made, something they could have done differently, you know, and it just brings tears and frustration. But I would hope that the men and women that were there will all, in their own way, find peace. Not satisfaction, but peace.
What about regular Canadians who think about Somalia? They might read about Somalia, and students, high school students. Like, what's the takeaway here?
I think the takeaway with two things. One, everything is not as you read and are told. That's the first thing. And two, that the men and women who made those decisions and did those things in that faraway place were only a few years older than they would be right now.
That's good perspective.
And what would you do?
Mm-hmm.
And do you know your Canadian values enough that you could hold on to them and that would be your lifeboat?
Mm-hmm. Because
you cannot become aggressive towards somebody else's stand.
Mm-hmm.
You need, like, that was one thing we always talked about, is what do we believe as Canadians? How do we, like, we can't leave here not being faithful to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that means being very selective sometimes in what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for the average high school student to say, you know what, they did some good things. And I think that's a bit of a hard sell sometimes. Not that we didn't do good things, but for the average young person, I would think they'd look at it and go, well, what did it look like?
Mm-hmm.
Can you prove it?
Mm-hmm.
And those things are hard to prove.
Sure.
But we were there. We tried. We invested ourselves. Canada took the best it had and put it in a very difficult place. You know, and I think that what neighbor wouldn't do that for another neighbor?
Mm-hmm.